Welcome. I think we're ready to start. So today we are going to talk about coronavirus and offending. And so to discuss these different aspects of coronavirus and offending, today I'm in a conversation with Professor Mawby. Thank you, Rob, for agreeing to be part of our, that webinar series. And so Professor Rob is from Harper University. And first, let me introduce him to you all. He previously worked at, Sheffield University, Leeds University, Bradford University, and Plymouth University, where he was Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice over 15 years. And now he is the editor of Crime Prevention and Community Safety Journal, and he has published numerous articles and books, and he's currently working on projects like maybe those are about the policing issues, victimology, victim services, and tourism and security. And also we have been doing research over, that for, 2 years. And so let's start, right? Okay, so COVID-19 is not a kind of, it's just not a kind of medical pandemic, but it's also a social fact that's totally disturbing all those, that our social order. So what has crime got to do with this, that medical emergency, Rob?
Well, of course, the headlines as far as the coronavirus pandemic are concerned are to do with health. Mortality rates, the effects that the pandemic has had on the health and care systems and on the economy. But it's also affected our lives in very fundamental ways, the ways we behave as individuals and the way we behave as social beings. And because of the pandemic, our behavior has been affected. It's been affected by the fact that we may be looking after people who are ill. We may be prevented from doing certain things because of government legislation, and obviously that will vary in different countries. And we may be affected by fear, the worry. We talk about fear of crime, but at the moment, fear of catching the COVID-19 is the predominant fear in people's minds, and that may affect their behavior as well. As a result of that, we stop doing some things that we usually do, and at the same time, we are more likely to do other things. For example, we're likely to spend more time at home, we're likely to spend more time on the internet than before. And this, of course, has a widespread implication for society. It's suggested, for example, that we're going to have a baby boom, that the birth rate's going to go up because people are spending a lot more time at home in the evenings. It's not surprising then that it might affect crime, both in terms of propensity to commit crime, whether people are in a position where they will offend, and in terms of the extent to which we as the general public put ourselves at risk and are likely to be the victims of crime.
Okay, so also there are lots of surveys ongoing right now. Maybe also we talk about it. Maybe you can remember about the, on the, perception of experts in criminology on the, crime trends. So why do criminologists think that crime rates and the patterns may have been affected?
A lot of criminologists explain crime not in terms of the who commits crime and why certain people commit crime and others don't, or others commit less crime, more in terms of the situation in which the crime occurs. They're more concerned with looking at why particular targets are chosen, at deterring people from offending in specific places. And they draw on theories of why specific targets seem vulnerable or attract offenders. And they argue that if you prevent potential offenders from committing specific types of crime, this will reduce the crime rate. This raises the question of displacement, of course. In other words, if you stop someone committing a particular crime, does that mean that they don't commit any crime, or does it mean that they commit a different crime? And I'll come back to that a bit later. At this point, though, it's important to stress that these criminologists assume that potential offenders who have their opportunity to commit offences reduced or their offence of choice reduced will not all choose to commit another offence instead, so the crime rate will actually be decreased. These criminologists come from a variety of backgrounds. You've got routine activity theorists, rational choice theorists, crime pattern theorists, just to name three. But essentially, they're focusing on opportunities, offenders' opportunities and decisions to target particular property or persons based on their knowledge and awareness of the target. So they'll be asking questions like, why do offenders opt to commit, for example, a robbery rather than a different sort of offence? Why do they target a business rather than a new individual, or vice versa? Why do they target a particular business, a shop, or a particular branch of a shop? And why do they decide to commit a crime at a particular time of the day or night? And in addressing those questions, they focus on what you might call the crime triangle, the three aspects of the situation that make a crime more or less likely: an available victim, a motivated offender, and a lack of protection or guardianship. And I'm thinking there of not just guardianship in terms of the police, but also guardianship provided by members of the public. And if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, that's dramatically changed the balance between those three dimensions. In terms of the availability of victims, people are going out less. They're out in public places less. Obviously, in some countries more than others, but as a general trend, and I mean, I'm talking from my experience clearly, entertainment venues are closed, so people are less likely to go out after dark. They're less likely to use public transport than they were before. Maybe they start riding bicycles or walk. This suggests that less victims will be available to steal, for offenders to target. Pickpockets, for example, work best in crowds. So if people are social distancing, if people are keeping apart from one another, it's much more difficult for pickpocket to operate. And public disorder offences linked to alcohol abuse will probably be lower because people are spending less time out and they're not drinking. They're out. They may be at home, but not out. Then if we look at the motivated offender, of course, people who might commit offences may have their mobility restricted. They may be less likely to go out, less likely to meet up with co-offenders. And when they do go out, they'll be more conspicuous. Offenders work best when they merge into a crowd, don't look conspicuous. If the streets are relatively empty, the people who are out there on the streets stand out more. And the third element is potential guardianship. That may be related to the police, if there are more police around, if other policing duties are reduced, or if the police are actively enforcing the lockdown. We had, for example, here, the police stopping cars on the main roads to see and question people about where they were going. Now, if you were an offender travelling to commit an offence, that increases the risk because that element of guardianship has been increased. If we look at members of the public as guardians, though, if people spend more time at home, then their home is better protected from burglaries, for example. They're also people who live next door may be more likely to be in. The idea of dormitories, big estates, which are largely empty during the daytime because people commute to work, that's far less the case at the moment because people are spending a lot more time at home and their neighbours are more likely to be in, and those neighbours are more likely to be looking out of the window, seeing what's going on. On the other hand, because there is always another side to the story, people are in public places, perhaps less likely, and therefore the possibility of crimes being witnessed, bystanders intervene in public, may be less. So if we look at things like burglary, and I'll come back to this perhaps a bit later, homes are more likely to be occupied, therefore offenders who might have chosen to break into my home are going to be find that a more difficult thing to do, because generally burglars like to break in when there's nobody there. Then it doesn't always work, but in most cases burglaries take place when the property is empty. But of course, the properties that are empty at the moment are a lot of shops, a lot of offices, a lot of those public buildings, schools, for example, and therefore the potential for committing offences in those environments will actually increase.
Okay, so I mean, in general, so what sorts of change might we expect? Maybe, for instance, what do you think about the online crimes? I mean, the cyber crimes. Well, maybe we can just put these routine activities to that online, the cyber victimization too also.
Yeah, let me take a few examples. Perhaps I can leave the online crime till last. But if we look at different types of crime, we start with burglary. As I said, homes are more likely to be occupied for most of the day, so we'd expect residential burglaries to decline. But burglars who operate, some sorts of burglar do operate when people are at home, what we call distraction burglaries. Burglars who knock on the door, particularly of older people, and make an excuse to come into the home, distract, maybe working in pairs, distract the victim, and one person is keeping the victim talking while the other one has a look around the house. So those sort of burglaries may be less likely to be affected than the traditional burglary of someone entering a home when it's empty. And of course, as I said before, offices, shops, etc., if they're empty for longer, if they've been closed down, if industrial estates are empty, closed, then that we would expect burglaries in those sorts of environments to increase. Let's go on to thefts from the person or robbery. If there are less people on the street, you'd expect theft from the person to decrease. That's particularly the case as far as pickpocketing, theft, which depends on some degree of subtlety or skill. They're likely to decrease. Whether a robbery, which includes violence, will decrease is perhaps a moot point. On the one hand, there are less people on the street, but on the other hand, if the streets are empty, the opportunity for an offender perhaps to ride along on a bicycle or a motorbike, snatch a bag off someone, it may be easier to commit those sorts of offences. So there's swings and roundabouts there. Other thefts, well, if people are using their cars less, we might expect less car-related crime. Cars that are parked in garages or next to houses may be better protected than those that are in public car parks. If there's more deliveries, at the moment, for example, I'm not going to the supermarket, I'm having the deliveries from the supermarket. A lot of people are doing that, therefore there are more delivery vans on the roads. That might mean that hold-ups, thefts from delivery vans is greater. It might mean that if the deliveries are left on my doorstep, the potential for those sort of thefts will increase. If we turn to violence, as I said, violence around pubs, clubs, the nightlife, the nighttime economy, we would expect to have gone down quite dramatically. Now, we don't know, of course, if people are spending more time at home, whether the extra tensions, the problems within the home may mean that that violence in the home increases. Perhaps I can come back to the evidence on that, such as it is in a little bit later. Mention internet internet-based crimes or phone-based crimes. That's an area where we'd expect crime to be increasing quite significantly. With people confined at home, dependence on the internet has risen. Correspondingly, frauds using the phone or the internet would increase. Some of those will be directly related to the pandemic. For example, scams over selling face masks or miracle cures increasing considerably. Some will be indirectly related.
Tests also, some coronavirus tests also they're selling, online.
Some indirectly related to the pandemic. For example, where customers are more dependent upon buying things online. It may be that fake companies are set up and people are buying goods online that never arise. That's a crime opportunity that's increased. And of course, we've also seen, certainly in Britain, where the government have been providing grants and loans of various sorts, fraudsters pretending to offer loans, getting details off people, of their bank details, that sort of thing, that will increase. With schools closed, rather differently, of course, children are spending a lot more time online, and that might lead to problems with children being groomed on the internet, more so than in the past. Finally, you and I are currently working on tourism and crime, and we do know that crime is closely related to tourism. Tourist areas are more likely to experience crime. Those tourists in those areas are more likely to be victims of crime than they are at home or other local people. And people going on holiday, particularly youth tourism, you tend to get crimes associated with them to do with public disorder situations. Now, of course, the tourist industry has been decimated over the last few months. I looked at the statistics for Turkey from March and April, when the number of foreign tourists coming into Turkey has gone down now to nearly nothing. So you've got a whole lot of tourist resorts that are relatively closed, and that is going to mean that the potential for crime in those areas would have been decreased. Although it may be that that offenders who live in tourist areas who would choose to commit crimes against tourists will turn to committing crimes against local people instead. And of course, in Turkey, there are a lot of tourist areas where there are second homeowners, people from Turkey or people from abroad who own second homes. And those places are going to be closed at the moment. So the potential for committing offences in those locations is perhaps going to rise.
Okay, so what is the evidences for all those, that crime types? Any?
I think there are three problems when we start looking at evidence. Firstly, of course, as any criminologist will say every day, crime statistics are a problem. They depend on victims reporting crimes and the police recording them. And of course, I mentioned domestic violence, violence in the home. And that's one of the crimes where crime statistics are particularly notoriously suspect. And so it may be that, and I'll come back to that in a second or two, but it may be that statistics don't really reflect the amount of violence, the increase that's taken place in the home. Secondly, of course, up-to-date statistics may be unavailable. In Turkey, I gather that police statistics tend to be somewhat behind. So if you want to look at the impact of coronavirus on crime in Turkey using official statistics now, I don't think you're going to get crime statistics, but maybe you'll enlighten me and tell me that's entirely wrong. In England, ironically, where statistics generally tend to be, our small area statistics tend to be fairly up to date. Police forces have actually taken people off the jobs where they were putting the statistics online and put them onto other tasks. So it's not as easy to look at that as it was 3 or 4 months ago. Finally, the problem with statistics is sometimes they're not detailed enough. I talked about burglary and burglary of the home, household burglary and burglary of offices or shops or whatever. And fine. So we might expect an increase in one and a decrease in the other. But will police statistics tell us that? Statistics on burglary, certainly here at local level, tend to put all burglaries in together. So it's not possible to disaggregate the statistics to look at whether there's been an increase in burglary of businesses and a decrease in burglary of houses. So those are the problems. A lot of criminologists are trying to get around those problems at the moment. And of course, there's a lot of impressionistic material available in the press. One of the studies in Britain that's taking place at the moment, or rather by a British academic, by a guy called Matthew Ashby, he's been looking at American statistics for 8 major cities, where the statistics are regularly updated online on a weekly basis. And he looked at different offence groups, 4 in particular, and he found that during the pandemic, serious violence in public places had decreased, but it had decreased in some cities more than in others. But the general pattern was for a decrease. The serious violence in people's homes hadn't risen, as we might expect, but as I said, that may be because the statistics are suspect there. That residential burglaries had declined in some cities, but not in all of them. And that personal robbery had stayed broadly the same. Now, there's some information from the British press that suggests different things that might have happened in the UK. For example, women's refuges and helplines have had an enormous increase in calls for help, which suggests that maybe women who are confined within the home with a violent partner may be frightened about calling the police, but may be more willing to get in touch with a non-police source of help. And there's some evidence, I think, from both the UK and from Europol that there's been an increase in child abuse online and grooming. And as I said, there's some evidence of an increase in internet fraud. We started to look at crime in tourist areas here. We don't quite get the weather of Turkey, but I do live in a rather nice tourist area with scenic area and beaches. Don't think the sea gets quite as warm as in Turkey, but it's a big tourist. Cornwall here is the second largest, most significant tourist area in the UK after London. We looked at the figures while they were still online, and they suggested that while crime in general had decreased after the pandemic really became evident and the lockdown came into place, that those parts of the area that were more tourist oriented, there'd been an even greater decrease in crime than in other areas. But as I said, it's very difficult to get really up-to-date, reliable information on what's happening as far as crime is concerned.
Clearly. Okay, so maybe the other issue is about the personal safety. So, I mean, are we safer?
I'd suggest that during the lockdown, certainly in the UK, some offence types have fallen and others have risen. I think there's probably been an overall decrease in crime, but that is dependent upon the balance between certain crimes increasing and others decreasing. And I think in general, there's been more of a decrease than there has of an increase. But that really depends on three perspectives. The first of those is the idea that some would-be offenders, some people who would have been committed offences, find the opportunity to commit their crime or their crime of choice restricted, and they therefore don't offend. That really depends on offenders being relatively specialised in their criminal behaviour, and perhaps less professional and less organised. It's less likely, for example, that young offenders will commit certain offences regularly that they won't change. What tends to be the case is that people who offend choose a variety of offences. They don't just stick to one offence, but it does vary. The second perspective, some would-be offenders find that the opportunity to commit their crime of choice is restricted, so they commit different sorts of crime. That's what I said earlier we call crime displacement. And that implies that offenders are relatively flexible in their choice of crime. It also might depend on their skill set, that they actually have the ability to commit different sorts of crime. Of course, some crime, if we're talking about internet fraud, for example, it might be more difficult to actually suddenly start committing frauds on the internet if you've been tending to commit robbery or burglary in person in the past. So that's the second perspective. The third perspective assumes that there's a pool of potential criminals who are deferred from offending under normal conditions, but due to temptation, financial hardship, stress, etc., are more likely to offend in the current situation. So that's the opposite side, basically, saying that people who weren't committing offences, who really had little chance that they were going to commit offences, but because of the current situation, are likely to offend. And that assumes that there's a pool of potential criminals who are deterred from offending under normal conditions, but change their attitude, their strategies, as I said. I think the first perspective is true of some offenders, but clearly perspectives 2 and 3 also apply in the current situation. And I'd suggest that this change in offending patterns can apply on at least 5 levels. It's what I've called SPOT. I like acronyms, so I was looking for something that made a word. It's SPOT with 2 T's. But if you take the 5 levels that I've identified, firstly, there's the spatial context. For example, crimes in real space may be reduced, but crimes in virtual space, on phone or on the internet, may increase. Since these require different skill sets, the increase there, I think, will be generally by different offenders rather than by the same offenders moving on to commit crimes online rather than crimes in the physical world. Secondly, there's the physical world itself. Violence committed in the home rather than in public places, as I've suggested. A shift towards more locally based crime. If it's more difficult to travel across the country, therefore many people will commit crimes nearer to home. Now we know that in general, offenders tend to commit their crimes relatively close, within a mile of where they, within a couple of kilometres of where they live. But that may be even more the case now than it was in the past. The idea of people travelling long distances to commit crime may be more dangerous. They're more likely to be stopped by the police than was the case. The third level, offence type. I mentioned household burglary and corporate burglary, and clearly you could see displacement here, that offenders who might have focused on breaking into houses could break into closed shops instead. That's a real possibility. Fourthly, the level of technique. I've said before that burglaries at home are more likely to be occupied. Distraction burglaries, where the burglary takes place due to subterfuge rather than forced entry, that may be increasing, and of course the pandemic could be used as an excuse for gaining entry. So someone knocks on the door of an older person and talks about the fact that they've been sent by the government to do a special cleaning of the house to make sure that there isn't any coronavirus about. And while they talk to the occupier, their colleague goes around the house ostensibly cleaning the house, but in fact looking for valuables. So we might get a change of technique, or rather some techniques being more common and other techniques being less common. And finally, target. I've mentioned the household burglary and a few times, but that's a good example of target, that you move from focusing on houses to focusing on shops or offices. And I mentioned in holiday resorts as well that maybe offenders will target local people rather than tourists. If you take Turkey, for example, local offenders in tourist resorts may see tourists as a better choice of target because those tourists carry more valuables with them. They've got passports on them that may be valuable for selling on. They may have more money than local people. But under the current situation, if there aren't any tourists, but you've still got your offenders around looking for income to keep them going or provide them with drugs or whatever else, may turn to local people. Or as I said before, they may turn to second homes, and you may find that the second homes that are empty, the holiday lets that might have tourists in them, are more vulnerable to being broken into because those guardians aren't available in the same way that they were in the past.
Okay, and also there are two questions from our head of department, from Professor Narda. I think the first question is more about the technique, right? I mean, because she just mentioned that, do you observe new type strategies for robbery? I think it's just more about new techniques, or is there a kind of change, that regarding the content of the robbery? I guess.
Sorry, did you say how long the timing, how long it takes to commit an offence?
No, it's about the technique. I mean, is there a kind of change?
Okay, sorry.
There are new techniques for robbery, as she's asking about it.
Yes, and I think, as I said,
we also discussed
you may get different techniques and more appropriate in the current situation. That may mean that some offenders change the techniques they use, or it may mean that they offend less, but other offenders who have particular skill sets, for example, if stealing off people who are if snatching bags, which isn't common in England, but bag snatching isn't very common in England at all. Robbery in general tends to be concentrated in about 10 or 12 of the larger cities. It's relatively rare elsewhere. But if you've got people who ride motorbikes, the roads are relatively free, then the technique of actually snatching a bag from a person walking down the road with no other people really anywhere close by, that technique may pay off more you may be more successful in committing that sort of crime than in the past. Whereas, as I said before, pickpocketing is going to be a lot more difficult if you're trying to sort of rub up close to someone in the street to pick their pocket, and that person's not worrying about whether you're a pickpocket. They're worrying about the fact that you're not keeping 1 or 2 meters away from them. So that sort of crime, that sort of technique is likely to be less viable in the current situation.
The other question is about the many offices were shut down, also many public buildings before the normalization. So how this affected crime? Maybe it's just more about unemployment, I guess, right? I mean, so maybe what do you expect about this unemployment? I mean, maybe.
Yeah, certainly that's one of the stress factors, and there are people who may have as I said, in terms of this group of people who wouldn't necessarily be committing any offences, but in the current situation, due to stress or financial hardships, is an important element of stress, may be pushed into committing crimes that they wouldn't have committed in the past. So we know that there's a link between unemployment and crime. If unemployment rates go up, we'll go back to the tourist area. You've got a lot of people in Turkish tourist resorts who are normally working in the tourist industry in various capacities. And now they haven't got a job, and they're maybe stuck in tourist areas without any income coming in. What are they going to do instead of that income? Yeah, unemployment, that's the social side that maybe the sorts of theories that I've been talking about tend to put less emphasis on, but it is very important as well.
And one more question from Professor Nardi too also. What about increased crime like violence against women and particularly adding sexual abuse of children?
Yeah, I think, well, within the home, of course, a different sort of stress factor is just the fact that if you are confined within the home, then you're spending more time with a smaller group of people within the home, where maybe in the past, if there's stress arises, there are problems arise, you can get out, you can leave the home. If you're stuck in the home with someone, then things are likely to escalate maybe. Or from the victim's point of view, you can't escape from the home. You can't, if your husband or your partner's getting drunk, you can't stick round to the neighbour until he sobers up. Yeah, I mean, domestic violence, and by domestic violence, I don't just mean violence against women, but violence against children in the home, or violence against old relatives. The idea that, they're holding you back, that you can't go out because you're worried about bringing the virus back into the home and affecting older people. So it's their fault you can't go out. So there are certain stress factors that are likely to be more common in this situation.
Clearly. Okay, so would you like to add anything?
No, just a couple of things that I was thinking through. Firstly, if crime is changing, patterns of crime are changing, I wonder, and I think the answer is very little, I wonder how far the police are adapting to dealing with the new crime situation. Do they think on their feet? Do they change resources? I mean, certainly the case in the UK is that internet crime gets very low priority with the police. But it tends to be franchised off to a specialist organisation, private organisation, which does very little, frankly. Now, if internet crime is increasing, fraud, not sexual grooming, but fraud certainly tends to be given very little priority by the police. I'm still getting 10 emails a week from someone usually in Africa, who wants to let me have 50 million euros, no questions asked.
Typically,
So, you know, and nobody's in the police is going to be the slightest bit interested in that. But if those sorts of crimes are increasing, then maybe police resources ought to be moving towards them. And if burglaries, for example, of private homes are reducing, maybe the police should be focusing more on checking up on industrial estates or city centres where we'd expect break-ins to be increasing. Are they doing that? I doubt it. But, you know, maybe they are. Maybe they are in some countries and not in others.
mm-hmm.
And the other thing occurred to me, we've talked about the new normal. I don't know whether that's a term that's used in Turkey, but certainly in Britain, we're talking about the new normal. Mm-hmm. Things we used to take for granted have gone, and we've got a whole new set of things that we take for granted. Is that going to apply to crime as well? Is there going to be a new normal? If crime patterns are changing, are they going to change back? Well, in many situations, yes. But also, in some situations, it may be that some people discover new types of crime that they're pretty good at and continue with them rather than going back to the sorts of crime they were committing before. And some people who haven't committed crime find that they've had the opportunity and it's pretty easy and it's pretty good money, so they're going to continue with doing that. So maybe next year, whenever this pandemic's over, the crime pattern will go back to what it was, but maybe in certain subtle respects it won't, and that the choice of particular types of crime will change in the long term.
We'll see. Yeah. Okay, so no other question, right? So then it's time to close the session, I think. So Rob, thanks for your contribution, and it's such a kind of pleasure for me to do this webinar with you. And I want to thank everyone. So thank you.
Pleasure. I only wish I could have been there in person rather than in rainy England.
Hope to see you.